Hello, my name is Dikwa Ogumade, and I'm here to help you pass your Security Plus certification. During today's session, we're going to cover the concept of identity and access management and why it's so important for an organization to get this right, especially from a security perspective. Let's talk about the concept of identity and access management. Let's take, for example, you just got hired to a new position at a bank. Congratulations, right? But now you have multiple credentials to access multiple applications within that organization. You have you have a credential to access your email application. You have a different set of credentials to access your Teams or your chat application. You have a different set of application of credentials to access your HR system, and you have a different set of credentials to access any other application within the organization. You can see how this becomes a complex problem very quickly. The concept of identity and access management helps an organization strategize and establish processes where an organization may want to employ one set of credentials that gives you access to all these various applications that you need to be able to do your job. So, in today's session, we're going to cover some of the key concepts of identity and access management and how some of these requirements or some of these concepts may show up as an exam question. And at the end of today's session, we're going to go through some questions and answers. Also, don't forget to go to my website and download this study guide. Let's jump right in. Now, the identity and access management section is tested under the security operations exam objective. And this exam objective covers 28% of the certification. This section focuses on the implementation and management of security tools. And in this video, we're going to cover concepts like authentication, passwords, and tokens. In this slide, the top bar is going to represent the information that we're going to cover, and on the bottom is going to be the information that we actually need to cover. So an example is on this slide, we have the identification piece of the IAM process. IAM is also known as Identity and Access Management. And below, I'm going to give an example or an illustration of how identification occurs within an organization. So let's go back to the example I gave earlier. You just joined an organization or you joined a bank, I believe, as a new hire. How does identification play a role in this process? Well, it's very simple. The organization you just joined has an HR system of record. This is where all employees within the organization or information about all employees within the organization is stored. Now, on the left-hand side, you can see that the identity information that you as a new hire has is going to be your full name, your social security number, and your home address. And we're assuming that these are some of the requirements that an organization or the HR system within that organization needs to register you as an employee of the organization. Now, you provided your full name, your social security number, and your home address. And the organization goes through a process to register you within the HR system of record. The HR system of record is how you get paid and how you request time off and any other ability or activity that has to do with the HR process. Now, with the information that you've provided to the HR representative, they've set you up within that system with your full name, and now you have an employee identification number. Also, they're able to record the department within the organization that you work in. Now, this is just 3 examples. An organization may have different types of metadata that's stored about an employee. Now, what does this equal? This equals your username and password, which becomes your credentials that you're able to use to access any application within that organization. All right. Now, this is a typical identification process because the identification process is really focused on the registration or the creating of a user account within a system of record. This would also apply if you were registering yourself on any other type of application or website. We can think about maybe your Facebook account or your bank account or any type of account that requires you to provide some level of identification so that it can be documented and translated into an identity that you use to access resources within that platform or application. And these are the things that I just explained. The identification process includes the process of registering and creating a digital account that represents your user identity. The security operations within the identity and access management domain of an organization is enabled because there needs to be a process to maintain and secure these digital identities. And these digital identities may apply to you as an employee or it may apply to you as a customer. Either way, an organization has to employ a strategy to maintain the security of these digital identities. You may hear a digital identity referred to as a user account, a user identity, or a digital account. These are synonyms of the same sort of word, right? It's just representing who you are in a digital platform or in a digital way. Now let's talk about authentication. And we're going to go through a simple authentication process as highlighted in this diagram. As you can see from the left side going in, a user requests to authenticate to access a resource. Now, a user isn't going to directly access that resource unless you've been approved or you've been authorized or you've authenticated to actually and approved to access that resource. Now, the best way to do that is to authenticate yourself against an authentication system. And as you can see here, the first part of the process is the user entering their username and password into a website and then requesting access to that resource. But before they access that resource, there's an authentication system that needs to authenticate this user. Now, the process of authentication is really verifying your credentials against what has been registered in the authentication system. So like we discussed in the first or previous slide, the identification process is registering your user identity, and the authentication process is establishing or verifying that the credentials you are providing to the authentication system matches what has been stored within for your digital identity. So the first part of the process is to initiate a request. And the second part of that process is the authentication system verifying that the credentials you've provided match what's already recorded within the system. Now, we can either accept the information you've provided or reject it and tell you to try again. And if it accepts, then access is granted to the resource, which is the third part of the process. Now, this is a very simple example or representation of what the authentication process looks like. For the Security Plus exam, the recommendation is to understand why an authentication system is really important. And if an authentication system is going to be developed or implemented within an organization, what are some of those principles that need to be established to ensure that your authentication system is well designed? Or better put, your authentication system must be securely designed. The first and most important thing for an authentication system is that it must store authentication information about various user identities, and this information must be stored securely. And then the next principle to keep in mind is that this authentication system must limit access to the authentication information only to authorized personnel. The authentication system must also be designed to only be updated by authorized personnel. The authentication system should be easy to use and should enable the authentication of users quickly. So these are some principles to keep in mind for the Security Plus certification about the authentication system. Now, let's talk about the authentication factors and how these can be implemented within an organization. The authentication factors, you can think of them as 4 major buckets. The first and most prevalent authentication factor is something you know. So something you know can be thought of as a PIN, a password, or some of those questions that come after you've added a password, or some passphrase that's only known to you and the authentication system. The next is going to be something you have. So this can be a mobile device or a key fob or a smart card. Something you are is solely dependent on your biometric information. And then somewhere you are is based on location. Now, these are all various types of authentication factors that can be designed within an organization to enable the authentication of employees or customers. These authentication factors can also be combined, which we're going to get into later. But it's important to understand the various types of authentication factors that can be established within an authentication system. Something else to also keep in mind for your Security Plus certification or Security Plus exam is going to be establishing a strong password. Passwords obviously fall within the something you know category. The characteristics of a strong password is the length of that password, the complexity of the password. This includes having numbers, letters, special characters. And the most important part of a password is keeping it secret. Organizations must establish strong password requirements, which include how long you can keep one password, or you can keep using the same password to authenticate into a system, and how um, how many times you can reuse that password, and from a history perspective, how many passwords can that authentication system remember, so that when you have to renew your password, you're not going back to a previously used password. So these are some of the security concepts that you need to keep in mind as you think about, as you prepare for your certification within the identity and access management domain under the authentication process for the something you know authentication factor. It's very important that organizations also enable their employees to store their passwords securely. And this is where password managers are most useful, because a password manager helps you store multiple passwords, and that way you don't have to write down your passwords in a sheet of paper, and you don't have to remember multiple passwords. You would need a subscription to a password manager like 1Password or LastPass. Those are just some examples of some commonly known password managers. And what these systems do is they provide you the ability to store multiple passwords on an application that you can access when you need it. And we also want to touch on passwordless authentication very quickly. Passwordless authentication using the authentication factor of something you have and something somewhere you are. I'll say that one more time. Passwordless authentication uses the authentication factors of something you have and somewhere you are. This is the first time that we're talking about the combination of multiple authentication factors. So that dovetails into a multi-factor authentication process. Simply put, a multi-factor authentication process is a process that's been established within an authentication system that requires you to provide two or more authentication factors in order for that system to authenticate you and provide you access to that resource. So in the example that's listed below, or in the diagram below, you can see that the identification process or the authentication process is a little bit more complex than what was shown earlier. This is still fairly simple, but just a little bit more complex than what was presented earlier. Now, the first part of the process is the same, which is you have to tender your username and your password and initiate an authentication request. And this authentication request is going to be reviewed by an authentication system. This authentication system is going to either approve or reject your authentication request. If it approves your authentication request, in the case of multi-factor authentication, the user would have registered not only their username, their password, but they would have registered a secondary form of authentication. This would include something you know, this would include something you have, somewhere you are, or something you are. So in this scenario, let's assume that the secondary factor of authentication that the user registered at the point of registration, of registering their identity, was their cell phone. And the process here is when you initiate and if when you initiate an authentication request with an authentication server or system, it's also prompting you to provide a one time password that has been sent to your secondary authentication factor. Now, this secondary authentication factor can be your phone, it could be your email address, it can be a call, it can be a text, whatever was agreed to at the registration period is what is going to be prompted in any subsequent authentication requests. So in this scenario, the user has initiated an authentication request with their username and password. The authentication system has approved their initial request and now has sent a one time password as a text message to that user's cell phone and is prompting the user to provide that one time password back to the authentication system so that the authentication system can validate that the user is indeed who they claim to be. And this is because the cell phone should be something that only the user has access to. Now, the user provides this information to the authentication system. The authentication system reviews this information, approves it, and sends and provisions that user access to the digital resource. Using a single authentication factor increases the risk of a cyber attack. And the second authentication factor makes it difficult for a successful password related cyber attack. What's important to note here is that the security of the resource is the reason why these authentication factors exist. There's a resource that we want to keep secure and we want to ensure that only those who are approved or have been authenticated to have access to this resource can access this resource. And as we discussed earlier, there are 4 buckets of these types of authentication factors. You have the something you know, which is a password or a PIN. You have the something you have, which is a key fob, a mobile device, or a smart card. Something you are, which relies solely on your biometric factor, like your face, your voice, or your fingerprint. And somewhere you are, which is based on location. This would be an example of the types of authentication factors that exist that can be combined to meet a multi-factor authentication process. Now, let's talk about the biometric authentication process. Now, same concept here applies, right? Which is a user must register themselves to an authentication system. You can either register your username, your password as your identity. You can register other factors of authentication, like the one time password that we just discussed, or you can go ahead and register yourself with a biometric system. A typical example would be accessing your mobile phone. I use an iPhone, and therefore, my iPhone is set up that whenever I want to authenticate, it needs to scan my face. The fallback there is that I can also provide it my ID or my PIN that I registered when I set the phone up. So in this scenario where your phone has 2 factors of authentication, you can either log in by way of biometric or you can log in by way of using a PIN. So this is not necessarily multi-factor authentication, even though your phone has the 2 factors. there may be certain configuration requirements that you need to set up on your phone that will require both um, authentication factors. So maybe it would ask you to put in your PIN and then also require you to show to pass a biometric scan. That would be multi-factor authentication. But if the phone is requiring you to only use one of the two authentication factors, that means your face scan or your PIN, that's a single authentication factor. I hope that makes sense. Now, for biometric authentication, a user must register their biometric information with a biometric system, and the biometric system should consider the following types of factors. And this is something that you should definitely keep in mind for the certification. You have the false rejection rate, which is a type 1 error. You have a false acceptance rate, which is a type 2 error. And then more importantly, you have your crossover error rate. And this crossover error rate is the intersection of where the false rejection rate and the false acceptance rate meet on a graph. Depending on the organization, you may want to increase this intersection point or you may want to reduce this intersection point. It's really up to the resource that's being protected. Other factors that need to be considered is going to be the speed of registration of this biometric system. You don't want a biometric system that takes too long to authenticate. And then you also want to factor in the implementation cost of implementing this biometric system against the resource that you're trying to protect. And you also have to remember the implementation cost is not just buying the biometric system. It also includes the cost of maintaining the biometric system year over year. So think of it as capital expense versus operating expense, right? So the false rejection rate is really how often is this biometric system falsely rejecting an authorized user, while the false acceptance rate is how often is this biometric system falsely accepting a user that shouldn't have access to the resource, right? So these are both sides of the coin, and from a mathematical or statistical perspective, you want to measure the false rejection rate as well as the false acceptance rate so that you can tailor or fine-tune the various rates to get your crossover error rate and then determine if the crossover error rate is acceptable or is at an acceptable level based on the resource that needs to be protected. As mentioned earlier, you also want to consider the speed of registration as well as the implementation cost of this biometric information. Now, let's touch on tokens. Tokens are really authentication factors that are categorized as something you have and can be generated in several different ways. Hard tokens are implemented through certificates or smart cards and sometimes can be one-time passwords. And soft tokens are one-time passwords that can be sent to your phone number or email address. One of the key differences here is that the soft token is a little bit less secure than the hard tokens. So that concludes our conversation for today. Now we're going to talk about some questions really quickly. What are the identity and access management phases? The identity and access management phases consist of identification, authentication, authorization, and accounting. Why must we protect passwords? We must protect passwords because not protecting passwords enable unauthorized individuals to have access to resources. What are authentication factors? The authentication factors that we discussed earlier are the something you have, something you know, somewhere you are, or something you are. This concludes this session. I'll see you in the next session. Thank you.